LBGTQ plus, and to ask the question, what comes next? So, I've got a section here, the rapid pace of moral change. Let me just read this to you, and then I want to make some comments about on this thought. The moral revolution isn't just a change in one area of morality. It is a comprehensive rewriting of a society. It is stunning to stop and ponder how quickly the culture has changed and to realize that there is no indication that it is going to slow down. I use the word stunning in the sense of disorienting. Unless you are under 20 years of age, it feels like you are living in a completely different culture because you are. I mean, for those of you who are above 20, does that sentence, does that make sense to you? Do you agree with that? Okay. Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I sometimes receive as feedback is, and it's usually from young people, is that the things you're talking about aren't going to happen. And so you're just overreacting. And I want to address that a little bit because I think that's important to, I want to push back on that. And one of the ways I want to push back on that is saying if you're under 20 years of age, you don't have enough life experience to realize that someone in my position has lived through change in our culture that when I was 20 years old, I would have said, that's impossible, that could never happen. And that's a fact. So if you think back to gay marriage, which is, now the law of the land since 2015, what are some dates? Do you remember some of the things that happened and when they happened? Do you remember what happened in, say, 2004? In 2004, one state, I think it was the first state that voted in favor of gay marriage. You may know what state that was. It was Massachusetts. Now, why do you think it was Massachusetts rather than, say, Kansas? And why? Liberal, yes, but why? What is it about Massachusetts? It's East Coast. If you follow these things, you realize that East Coast, West Coast, and then you got flyover country. And flyover country is a disparaging phrase that the coastal elites use. Because they want to, if you're on the East Coast, you want to go to Hollywood and visit your elite friends in Hollywood, you have to fly over. And why would you ever stop in that flyover country? So it's not a compliment. But on these East Coast, West Coast, you've got a very different culture. And but Massachusetts, the reason for this is Harvard University, don't you think? I mean, it's Cambridge, Massachusetts. So the closer you get to a major city, and the closer you get to a major university, the more liberal the culture becomes. So in 2004, in Massachusetts, the state approved gay marriage. Now, what did people in flyover countries say when that happened? Never happened here. Never happened here. That's impossible. Could not happen here. And so you might remember that there was an effort, there was talk about it, of a constitutional amendment at the federal level to define marriage as between one man and one woman. Do you guys remember this? And I remember my response to that was, this is an issue that concerns me, but the federal Constitution is, in my mind, a sort of sacred document, right? Not in the same sense that the Bible is, but there's a sacredness to the Constitution, and we should not amend it lightly. And so my attitude was basically, I don't think we should amend the Constitution to define marriages between one man and one woman, because I think it's absurd that this would ever become the law of the land. Okay, so that's started in 2004 with the state of Massachusetts. By 2015, the unthinkable happened. So how much math whizzes, how much time are we talking about here? 11 years, right? Now, what happened in 2008 in the state of California? Proposition, was it 8 or 4? Proposition 4? The state of California in 2008 voted to define marriage as between one man and one woman. Can you believe that, given how liberal California is? Stunning. It was 52 to 47%. So, not an absolute home run, but still a fairly sizable victory. So California, what most of us would say is the most liberal state in the United States, is in 2008 said, we believe that marriage should be between one man and one woman. What happened? The voters, of course, made that decision. But what happened to their decision? It went to the judiciary, and the courts threw it out. So the voters said, this is our belief system, and the judiciary said, yeah, you can't do that. And then from 2008 to 2015, with the Obergefell decision, same-sex marriage became the law of the land. And then what we've discovered, and you see this, here's a totally different example, but what I'm trying to get at is when you make something legal, people's perception changes really quickly. If it's legal, people all of a sudden assume that it's okay. And I have seen this in terms of like the CR ministry, the Celebrate Recovery ministry. It's not unusual to have someone say cannabis or pot or marijuana, it's not an issue. It's not really, it's just okay. Because now it's legal in our country, or in the state of Oregon anyway. It's still illegal at a federal level, but in Oregon and so Pendleton has, I think, 4 dispensaries now. And so because it's legal, people who have addictive issues will say that's not an issue because it's legal. But everybody recognizes that cannabis is a gateway drug to harsher drugs. But when you change the designation and say this is no longer illegal, it's legal, it changes people's thinking quickly. And so I think now if you go out and survey people, I think the majority of Americans will say that same-sex marriage is a good thing. But that's come about because it's been deemed legal. So for anybody who says to me, oh, Pastor John, you're just a reactionary. Christian colleges are never going to be forced to violate their religious convictions on these issues, and you're just scaring people. Well, I've lived long enough to see the impossible become reality. And when I came here to pastor this church, the thought that gay marriage would be the law of the land was an unthinkable reality, but it's now here. And so we need to recognize that these things are happening, and unless there's some check put upon them, the culture is going to continue to change, and I think you're dead wrong to think otherwise, because history is just against you on this. So here's a British intellectual. That which was repudiated must be celebrated. That which was celebrated must be repudiated, and those who will not celebrate must themselves be repudiated. Doesn't that describe our culture? To a T. Gay marriage was repudiated through all of human history until just very recently, but now it's celebrated, and that which was once celebrated is now repudiated. If you don't get with the program, you're going to be repudiated. There's just no doubt about it. Which brings me back to something we looked at earlier, but I just want to return to this briefly. Earlier in this class, we talked about the concept of trying to do ethics inside the box. And now would be a good time to revisit that concept. Doing ethics inside the box is doing ethics without God. Without a transcendent lawgiver, we lack a solid foundation for determining right from wrong. But it's this last sentence, which I think I have a typo there, right? I've got when we twice. Do I? Yeah, I do. When we lose transcendence, all that is left is the inward gaze. When we lose transcendence, all that is left is the inward gaze. You understand what that, let me just stop there and let me ask you, explain that statement to me. I'm assuming there could be people here who don't really understand what that means. What does that mean?
I think they used to call it belly button, didn't they? Gazing at your belly button, I think that was the old term.
Okay. What's that?
We become all about ourselves.
Yeah, everything is right in our
For me,
mind.
it's good for me, and you need to let out.
Okay.
We become our own gods.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when we say as a culture that if there is a God, we don't know who he is, we don't know what he thinks, for practical purposes, we're functioning as if there is no God. And that is what our culture is doing. God is irrelevant. And so there's no God in people's minds outside of the box of this created reality. A God who's outside and above, and a God who's a lawgiver. That concept has largely just been erased. And so then all we've got is the box, and we're all living in this box. And when you cut off yourself from the idea of the transcendent, and the word transcendent means above or outside of ourselves, when you cut yourself off from that, all you have is the inward gaze. And I mean by that, people just look inward. Everybody becomes their own God, and you look inward and you follow whatever it is that yourself is telling you is the way you should walk. And that is a description of our culture today. And so I want to have you turn your paper over. I've got this poem. I'm not much for poetry. I just got to be honest with you. But I want to read this to you. William Blake was a romanticist. He lived 200 years ago. And so much of what he's writing here is really almost predictive of where we are today. Rousseau is another person who would think in a similar way. The belief system here is there's a denial of original sin. Okay, we need to start there. What's original sin? What's the Christian doctrine of original sin? Okay, and we want to, because that's right.
As Adam fell, so fell we all.
Yes, an inherited sin nature. Okay, I like the way R.C. Sproul states this, because everything that's been said is true. But R.C. Sproul clarifies. He says original sin doesn't primarily focus upon the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden. It focuses more on the results of Adam and Eve's sin in the garden. Okay? In other words, the fact that we're all sinful by nature because of what Adam and Eve did in the garden. So in the Bible, the human race really is thought of, we're individualistic. That's our culture. That's the way we see things. But the Bible doesn't work that way. The Bible sees the human race as a whole. And so Adam and Eve are like the roots of the human race, and we're like the leaves of the human race. But we're all part of the same tree. We're all organically connected. And so the sin in the garden not only impacts Adam and Eve, but it impacts all the children of Adam and Eve. And so we all inherit a sin nature. Now, someone like William Blake doesn't believe that for a moment. He utterly rejects that concept. And so if you reject that concept, what do you say about the human heart? Yeah, so whatever your human heart feels must be basically normal. And therefore, whatever is normal under this way of thinking should be pursued. Does that make sense? Okay, so do ideas have consequences? I mean, the consequence of denying original sin is pretty great. So you need to understand that in this poem, that's where he's coming from. And the Romantics believed that the problem with the world is culture. You know, culture's kind of corrupted everything. You've got people who are born basically good, and then they're forced into unnatural relationships and structures because of the culture that they're living in. Okay? That's somewhat of a contemporary idea if you think about it. I mean, it's a different intellectual current, but can you see how people think that way today? I mean, structural racism, and it's all the structures that are messed up. People are okay, it's just the structures that create all the problems. So people are born with, you got a strong sex drive. Okay? Should that concern you? No, because this is the way you're born. And so some people have said before that cheating is in the human heart, right? Monogamy is not natural. A lot of people say that. Do you agree with that? Why don't you agree with that? Well, we don't care about God because we've cut ourselves off from the transcendent. Okay? Because we're doing ethics in the box. So God's irrelevant and maybe doesn't even exist. So we can't. But the church says that, and so we got to hate the church. So we've got these, somehow, we don't know how it exactly happened, we've got these structures that have developed over the centuries, and they're confining people. And they're hurting people. Because they're not allowing people to just live out of what they feel. Okay? Let me read this poem with some of that background. I went to the garden of love. Now, what is William Blake referring to here? You think of garden, that's the opposite of city, right? It's kind of the opposite of civilization. It does make you think of Adam and Eve just a little bit. You know, it's primitive but authentic. Back to the beginning. But when he says the garden of love, what he's thinking of is what we would call just sort of free love or free sex. Maybe kind of what people before my time, but the 1960s, you know. But he's saying this is a good thing. And what's happened is that society has stifled this. And that's created all sorts of, sickness within the human heart. So I went to the garden of love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. Okay? I don't think I need to explain what he means by the word play. Okay? But something's happened which is going to ruin his life and ruin his fun and ruin his love and ruin his play. And that something is that there's a chapel that has been built in this garden. That's a problem. The gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love. that so many sweet flowers bore. So his approach is, well, I'm just going to ignore this chapel, this church, this structure that's been created because it's not natural and it's impeding what my heart tells me. And I saw it was filled with graves. So this garden is now filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be. And priests in black robes were making their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. You understand what he's saying here? I would say this is an evil poem. He is saying the human heart from birth is good. But because of the church and other structures within society, we don't allow people to just express what they feel and live as they feel. We're restricting them in various ways, and public enemy number one is the church. The church has turned my garden of love into a cemetery of death. And so what people like William Blake were saying is we need to rip down the structures and the society and get back to the headwaters of the human race, and we'll just discover when we do this that everything will be great. Now, I don't know what happens to families in this scenario, because, families don't do well outside of monogamy, for instance, right? What happens to children in this scenario? Well, children, I think, will become the victims of this. But this kind of thinking it permeates so many of the intellectuals of, people like Marx, people like Freud. Their ideas might not be, if you go to the streets of America and say, what did Karl Marx believe or what did Freud believe? I'm suspecting most Americans will say, huh? But the ideas have made it into the culture, and they influence the culture in really profound ways. Anyway, I've kind of got maybe a little off target here. So, any comments on that?
Pastor John, I don't think that's precisely on target, because I was looking at Romans 1:18-23 as the polar opposite, that natural law was written on our hearts. Even though we are, our hearts are evil, God still wrote His law on our hearts, and we suppressed them and became fools. And what says, God and changed the word of incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and animals and living things. And precisely what he's saying is we need to go back to acting like animals. And it's just incredible.
The other thing is, we talked about it when we were talking about dignitary harm, how with the inward gain, so to speak, there really is a lack of humility in that, because, they're not very charitable in terms of, allowing for other viewpoints, to say, well, particularly in regards to religious liberty, so, to say this is a violation of my conscience, they're not that charitable, if their own conscience is allowing anything, but my conscience is not allowing anything because of what, I submit to the authority of Spirit. They're not that charitable. The other thing, I was saying, Terry and I, we were part of a parenting class, quite a few years ago, but one of the fundamental principles of parenting, in the Christian worldview, that a child has to learn very early is I am a person under authority. And because that's true for us all times of life. And there's really no time when we are not under some authority, and it's the opposite of what, it's so many of these things, as they talk about Romans 1, where it's just what good became evil, just a complete switch of what, but that's a really fundamental principle all
So it's Nietzsche who said, God is dead and we killed him. Okay? And all these philosophers really share that basic perspective. But that's what I'm trying to get at in this sentence. When we lose transcendence, all that is left is the inward gaze. God is dead, we killed him. Well, if God is dead, where are you going to look for truth? Where are you going to look for right or for wrong? And of course, we realize there's all sorts of problems here because right and wrong become meaningless concepts ultimately if God is dead. If there's no one outside of the box or above the box, then you're just playing foolish games to say that there's anything right or there's anything wrong. Because ultimately, who determines that if there's no God? Well, you do. And since there's 6 billion and counting on the planet, there's 6 billion different perspectives. Okay? And so at that point, morality becomes a sort of a statistical morality, where you just sort of count noses and make decisions, I guess. You know what statistical morality is? There's another R.C. Sproul comment. How did he put that? You determine right from wrong just based on popular vote, essentially. So if 75% of children cheat on tests in grade school, then the majority cheat, and therefore it must be normal human behavior to cheat, and therefore it must be good that children cheat. And by the way, it's probably higher than 75%. Okay, do you agree with that? It's good that children cheat. Well, most of them do it, so William Blake would say, well, it's normal human behavior. But that's what you're left with if you take, a sense of a transcendent lawgiver out of the equation and just say, whatever my heart tells me, this is what I'm going to do. And so I guess I'm saying, I do believe this, one of the most important sentences in the whole class to this point is this sentence here: when we lose transcendence, all that is left is the inward gaze. This is where the idea of the autonomous self comes in. The self-law. I make the rules for myself. I am my own God. Now, it's interesting, Sigmund Freud really followed this line of thinking. How much do we know about Freud? I don't know a lot about Freud, but I have been reading a book that's got quite a bit of his thinking in it. And Freud, he really anticipates the current culture in that Freud understood humanity at a fundamental level of identity. What are we? How would Freud answer that question? How would you answer it as a Christian? At a fundamental, deepest level, who are you? What's the answer to that? I'm a child of God. Yeah, especially if you're a Christian. But for the whole human race, we would say we are men and women created imago Dei in the image and likeness of God. That's our deep identity. Now, Freud doesn't believe in God. He's essentially an atheist, so he's not going to give that answer. So what's Freud's answer? What's our deepest identity? I'm a sexual being. Now, does that sound familiar today? It's bizarre. I mean, there's a difference between, how do I state this? There's a difference in our culture today. I mean, sex has always been an important part of the human experience, obviously, but today we've got all these identities that are based on sex. That's new. It's bizarre, actually, in how new it is. So I'm transgender, and I'm this or I'm that. I mean, we're making that the deepest truth about us as individuals. Freud would agree with that. And so one of the reasons that Freud was so interested in even children in this arena was that he wanted to prove that sex as your identity is from cradle to grave. So I don't want to offend anyone, but for Freud, breastfeeding was a sexual act, okay? Which is a bizarre idea, right? But that's the way Freud thought. Now, Freud also adopted all we're talking about here. There is no God, so my heart is not sinful. So at the core of me, my identity is I'm a sexual being. Monogamy, traditional marriage restricts this. It's not natural. And so Freud went all the way with this, and then he came to a point where he said, I've got a problem. And his problem was, I see some value in religion, even though I hate the whole idea of it. Freud was a real God hater. But he said, I cannot deny that children need moms and dads. And children need a family. And so everything about me is saying that I'm an autonomous self, I should pursue sexual gratification. Monogamy is unnatural and actually causes phobia or causes psychological diseases within people. But what about kids? All right? But what I'm trying to do here is probably just another way of saying that a lot of the things that we're dealing with right now, the roots of this are pretty deep. They really do go back hundreds of years into the intellectual currents that have been developing over the last several centuries. And it's all rooted, I think, in this thought that we have cut ourselves off from God. That's what all of these philosophies have in common. They've cut themselves off from the transcendent, and therefore they look inward for truth. And since we know the human heart is sinful and broken, we know that's a recipe for absolute disaster. Okay? So that's one major takeaway today. The other takeaway is, don't tell me that the things that are coming aren't coming. Because I'm old enough to know that the things that I thought would never come, they have come. Okay? What's next? As we look forward to the T. The T's there for a reason, right? And by the way, LGBTQ plus is no longer the fullest expression of this. There's 2 letters that have been added to it. I can't remember what they are. And no one can keep track of this anymore. But the T. So I've got some suggestions. Here's an idea that I've encountered in some of the things that I've read. It really does describe where we're at in a lot of ways, but it's the idea of a wed-lease marriage. So the fill-in here is wed-lease. It's W-E-D-L-E-A-S-E. And it's described this way. 2 people commit themselves to marriage for a period of years. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever term suits them. The marital lease could be renewed at the end of the term, however many times a couple likes. The messiness of divorce is avoided, and the end can be as simple as vacating a rental unit. Now, we're kind of living in that world right now, I realize, but this would be like a legal concept that would be added to marriage, where you can get married and actually say, we're going to be married for 5 years. And it's set up that way so that at the end of 5 years, if I'm not happy in this relationship, I can just totally walk away from it. I read that, that was in the Washington Post. The second one here, lowering the age of consent. I see this is something that will happen. I mean by that, there's just this blurring of, people under 18 sexually involved with someone in their 40s, and the culture says that's okay now. I see that as quite likely. The third one, we're going to spend some time with this one, is polygamous marriages. polygamous marriages. So a return of polygamy. And I want to read to you a lengthy paragraph here from John Roberts. And John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he's writing concerning the Obergefell decision, which legalized gay marriage. And he's arguing that polygamous marriage is a foregone conclusion after Obergefell. There's nothing to stop it. So these are his words. Although the majority, now what does he mean by the majority? Of the 9 justices, right? 9 justices, Obergefell was a 5-4 decision. So 5 justices said, we think gay marriage should be the law of the land. 4 justices said no. So when Roberts uses the majority, he's referring to the 5 who voted for gay marriage. He says, although the majority randomly insert the adjective to in various places, it offers no reason at all why the 2-person element of the core definition of marriage may be preserved while the man-woman element may not. Let me just stop there because I want to make sure we understand. You understand what he's saying? He's saying traditionally marriage has been thought of as a man and a woman, and marriage has always been thought of as involving 2 people. He's saying Obergefell changes one piece of this. It's no longer just a man and a woman. It could be a man and a man or a woman and a woman. When you make that change, you redefine marriage. On what basis can you limit it to only 2 people? See, if you undo the one side of this, how do you maintain the other side? And he's absolutely right. There's no logical way that you can. Indeed, from the standpoint of history, so now he's going to make a historical argument. From the standpoint of history and tradition, a leap from opposite-sex marriage to same-sex marriage is much greater than one from 2-person union to plural unions, which have deep roots in some cultures around the world. You understand what he's saying here? Okay, he's making historical argument. There's been, throughout history, there have been cultures that accepted polygamy, but no cultures accepted same-sex marriage. So it's a much greater hurdle to accept same-sex marriage than it is polygamy. If we've hurdled to same-sex marriage, how can we limit it to 2 people? It's very logical. If the majority is willing to take the big leap, it is hard to see how it can say no to the shorter one. It is striking how much of the majority's reasoning would apply with equal force to the claim of a fundamental right to plural marriage. And he quotes here, if there is dignity in the bond between 2 men or 2 women who seek to marry, and in their autonomy to make such profound choices, why would there be any less dignity in the bond between 3 people who, in exercising their autonomy, seek to make the profound choice to marry? If a same-sex couple has the constitutional right to marry because their children would otherwise, and he quotes again, suffer the stigma of knowing their families are somehow lesser, why wouldn't the same reasoning apply to a family of 3 or more persons raising children? If not having the opportunity to marry, quote, serves to disrespect and subordinate gay and lesbian couples, why wouldn't the same imposition of this disability serve to disrespect and subordinate people who find fulfillment in polyamorous relationships? Did you follow that argument? All right. So is that going to happen? Polygamous marriage, is that going to happen in the United States? Okay. Anybody think it's not going to happen? Any takers on that? Are we just overreacting this morning? Not going to happen. Couldn't happen.
Do you remember partial birth abortion? When we first heard that that was being considered, I thought, there is no light. Don't even pay attention to it, because that'll be shut down.
I did hear you back there. I just chose to ignore you. Clara said it's already happening, and she's right. You know where it's happening? Someone said Utah. That's true, but that's a different issue, right? I mean, that's the LDS, the Mormon tradition, and there is a lot of plural marriage in southern Utah and northern Arizona. That's just sort of under the radar, but Massachusetts. Yeah. So back in 2004, gay marriage started in Massachusetts. And we all said, oh, never will happen at a national level. Couldn't happen. And now, 2015, it's here. So people could be sitting here today thinking polygamous marriage, that just couldn't be. Well, it's here in the state of Massachusetts. Now, it's not at a state level yet, but there are cities within Massachusetts. Which city would you think it might be? Anyone want to make a guess? Cambridge. What's at Cambridge? Harvard University. Okay? Now, I'm not saying this is a possibility. I'm saying this is a reality right now in America. So what Roberts anticipated has already become a reality in the state of Massachusetts. 2 municipalities in Massachusetts have already legalized polygamous or polyamorous marriages. It is important to point out that in 2004, well, we've talked about this, Massachusetts was the first state to legalize gay marriage, and so Massachusetts is once again taking the lead on this. So I want to read to you, I've got to get to this. This is from the briefing back on March 15th, and I'll just read several paragraphs. But what starts in Massachusetts doesn't stay in Massachusetts, okay? It's just naive if you think it will. You're hopelessly naive. The Cambridge Council in the city, I'm picking up mid-sentence, has decided to become the second municipality in the entire United States to legalize domestic partnerships between 3 or more people. Remember the language domestic partnerships? That was what was used as, marriage by a different name. Before there was gay marriage, there was domestic partnerships. It's just marriage by a different name. Now, when you're thinking about this, just recognize that Cambridge is described here as the second municipality. That means there was a first, but the first in this case was just a matter of less than a year ago and is also in the state of Massachusetts and also fairly close to the academic concentration there in Cambridge. That city was Somerville, and last July, USA Today reported that the city has adopted a domestic partnership policy, including polyamorous couples. Now, what does the word polyamorous mean? Amorous means like love, and poly's many, right? I assume you guys have heard that word before, but polyamorous means, multiple people in a sexual relationship together. So this town formed this policy by a unanimous vote of the city council. Now, the argument was society's changing. Social structures are changing. The definition of the family is changing, and the law has to keep up with those changing definitions. If the law doesn't keep up, we're told that there will be people who will be vulnerable. Vulnerable, okay, that's a buzzword, that's a key word. I mean, dignitary harm. Or kids in these relationships that will be made fun of because the relationships are not recognized as a legitimate form of marriage. So people are vulnerable, they're going to get hurt because their own relationships would not be recognized. Now, just understand something. This is virtually exactly the argument that was made by Justice Anthony Kennedy when he wrote the majority opinion in the Obergefell case in 2015 legalizing same-sex marriage. He said that refusing to legalize same-sex marriage would be a dignitary harm to those who are in same-sex relationship and to their children. I'm skipping down here. A domestic partnership in Cambridge now means, this is a quote, this is what marriage is becoming. The entity formed by two or more persons who are not related and file a registration declaring that they're in a relationship of mutual support, caring, and commitment, and intend to remain in such a relationship. They also have to say that they are not in a domestic partnership with others outside of this partnership, and that they consider themselves to be a family. What at stake here is the redefinition of family from anything that is based on a familial construct. You know what that means? Like a blood relationship or adoption. Which has been true through the millennia, and that is by blood descent. That is a man and a woman coming together in marriage as a recognized union, and the children who are produced by that marriage in the larger extended family of blood kinship. Add to that those who come into the family by adoption. Now, who's behind this? Well, I'll give you some names. The main advocacy group behind this is called PLAC, and we're told that it's a coalition comprised of the Chosen Family Law Center, the Harvard Law Review, LGBTQ plus Advocacy Clinic, and the members of the American Psychological Association's Committee on Consensual Non-Monogamy. So I just mentioned 4 different organizations that have come together calling themselves PLAC, and they're pushing this. It goes on, interestingly, to comment that in the situation in Cambridge, when the city council voted on this, there were 2 council members who voted present, and so they wouldn't take a position. And one of them was the mayor, and the mayor is the first openly lesbian black mayor. But now she's behind the curve on the sexual revolution because she apparently has an objection to polyamorous marriage, although she's very much in support of same-sex marriage. So figure that out. I don't think you really can. Okay, any comments? Or are you just getting depressed?
I knew a few years back that announced that they were going to be polyamorous and love is love and they could love whoever. We went to their wedding. They were supposedly Christ followers. Well, now they hate each other and they're divorced. It's like, go figure, that was a real shocker.
Yeah, that's a real situation that Maria and I know these individuals. One of them we knew at one time quite well. And I mean, they did the polyamorous open marriage type thing. You know, it's not, they don't yet have legal standing, but let's just mix it all up and.
We can love lots of people.
Yeah, and we'll have, you know, one man and a couple women living together, and it didn't work very well, did it? That's a disaster, actually.
So there's polyamorous fluidity?
Yeah.
I suppose so, yes.
Mm-hmm. Love, and you can love lots of people in lots of ways. And
There's an organization that is a Christian veterinary union, but they're kind of reorganizing, and I ran across this, it's a long story, but at any rate, they were referring I say it's called Christian transition, because if they're using language, which I hadn't seen before, if it's meant to be all-inclusive, then if you ran across that.
I have not ran across that, but it does make me think of something that we just encountered a week or so ago with Mother's Day. And there were people referring to it as Birthing Persons Day. You know, so that kind of language is carefully chosen, and it's all wrapped up in, you know, in the sexual revolution, because transgender, you can be, you know, according to that ideology, you can be male now and have a child. So.
I think one of the things that there's to realize and mention is the fact that the social problems that would come from these types of relationships, child abuse, child neglect, and also marital abuse in large scale.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was a couple of weeks ago, the major argument that I made in terms of why gay marriage should not be accepted in our culture. Not only is it unbiblical, but it's also, it makes children become the victims of all of this. And even Freud seemingly understood that. Well, we need to close for today. We'll come back to this last fill-in. But before we do that, I do want to just read these words to you. This is where I came after thinking through this. These are my words. Some envision, and I think this is right, where is this all going? Some envision a future without marriage. I think that's where this is going. A future without marriage and therefore without the nuclear family. Now, I realize how radical that sounds. But one of the deep ironies is that we have gay marriage. And I'm not saying that, I'm now saying it from a different perspective. If you go back 30, 40 years ago, the last thing that homosexual men wanted was marriage. They had no interest in that. And in fact, all the philosophers that so much of this is rooted on, they were all anti-marriage. They didn't believe in marriage. They thought marriage made people psychologically sick because it restricted you. I mean, Hugh Hefner is the model here. Okay? We'd all be Hugh Hefners if it weren't for the structures of society that restrict our freedoms and our liberties. So that was the thinking of particularly the gay male population in this country. We don't want marriage. We don't want any of this stuff. We want to be sexually free with as many people, period. And I think what happened is that I think that gay marriage is a part step to a further goal. It's normalized homosexuality in a way that was unthinkable, you know, a few decades ago. They're just like us now. I mean, they're in committed marriage relationships. I don't think that's where this ends. I think the ultimate goal is to strip away, because from their perspective, it's like the church has forced this upon all of us, or other religious traditions. And so I think the ultimate goal is to just destroy marriage as an institution. And then, of course, you think, well, what happens to family? You know, and you might say this is nuts, but I actually kind of think that I know there are people who feel this way. So some envision a future without marriage and therefore without the nuclear family. In this storyline, the subversion of marriage that we are witnessing in our culture serves the ultimate goal of destroying marriage completely. Is the foundational structure of society. So they are thinking in terms of changing things far, far more radically than we can even hardly imagine. So, okay? So we'll finish this next Sunday and we'll go on to BLM. Okay?